That night, nobody knew this was part of the war. December 3rd, 1944. The radio went silent at 11:47 p.m. In a concrete bunker beneath the Ardennes forest, three men sat around a wooden crate. One held a cigarette that had burned down to his fingers. One held a letter he couldn't finish writing. The third held a photograph of someone who would never see him again. Outside, snow fell without sound. The kind of snow that covers footprints. The kind that makes the world disappear. The kind that turns living men into ghosts before they're dead. The bunker was 8 feet by 12 feet. Concrete walls, 2 feet thick. A single bare bulb hanging from a wire that swayed with every artillery shell. Even the distant ones. Even the ones that fell 20 miles away. The floor was dirt, always damp, always cold, always smelling of fear and unwashed men, and secrets that nobody wanted to carry. Sergeant Mackenzie checked his watch. Third time in 10 minutes. The hands hadn't moved fast enough. They never did when you were waiting for something that might not come. The radio should have crackled by now. Should have brought the voice from headquarters. Should have told them what to do with the information they carried. Information that could change the war. Information that could end it. Information that could make it worse. But headquarters was 40 kilometers away. Headquarters didn't know about the convoy that had passed 2 hours ago. Didn't know about the trucks that weren't supposed to exist. Didn't know about the faces Mackenzie had seen through his binoculars. Young faces. Scared faces. Faces that looked exactly like his own. Faces that wore uniforms identical to his own. Faces that spoke his language. Faces that were supposed to be the enemy. Mackenzie had been watching convoys for 8 months. Supply trucks, troop transports, medical vehicles with red crosses that sometimes carried ammunition, sometimes carried worse things. Things that didn't have names in the manual. Things that weren't supposed to exist according to the Geneva Convention. But this convoy was different. This convoy carried American soldiers. American soldiers going east. American soldiers who weren't supposed to be there. American soldiers who looked like prisoners, but weren't guarded like prisoners. The binoculars sat on the wooden crate. German binoculars. Zeiss lenses. Clear as daylight, even at midnight. Mackenzie had taken them off a dead officer in September. The officer had been young, maybe 22, had a photograph in his pocket, a girl with blonde hair and sad eyes. Mackenzie still carried that photograph, didn't know why, didn't know what he was supposed to do with the face of someone he'd killed, someone who might have been somebody's Mackenzie. Private Coleman struck another match. Fourth one, in 20 minutes. The flame danced for 3 seconds. Went out. He didn't light the cigarette, just watched the match burn down to his fingertips. Just like the one before, just like the one after. Coleman had been striking matches for 6 hours. Ever since the convoy passed. Ever since he'd seen what Mackenzie had seen through those German binoculars. Ever since he'd realized that some wars have more than 2 sides. The matches were German too, taken from the same dead officer. Everything useful came from dead men. The radio was American. The ammunition was British. The rations were Canadian. The water was from a well they dug themselves in ground that belonged to Belgium before the war. Now it belonged to nobody. Now it belonged to whoever was willing to die for it. Tonight, it belonged to 3 men who didn't want to be there, but couldn't leave. Coleman had been a mechanic before the war, fixed cars in a garage outside Detroit, had plans, was going to marry a girl named Betty, who worked at the diner on Michigan Avenue, was going to buy a house with a white picket fence and a dog and everything you're supposed to want when you're 23, and the world makes sense. But the world stopped making sense in December 1941. Stopped making sense completely tonight when he saw American soldiers being transported east like cargo, like property, like something that wasn't human anymore. The cigarette in Coleman's other hand was his last, had been his last for 3 days, but he couldn't smoke it, couldn't finish something when he didn't know if he'd live long enough to regret it. The tobacco was dry, American tobacco, Camel brand. The pack had been a gift from his sister, sent from home with a letter that said she was proud of him, said he was fighting for freedom, said he was a hero. Heroes don't sit in concrete holes watching their own countrymen disappear into the darkness. The letter in Corporal Hansen's hand was to his mother, had been to his mother for 6 days. 3 lines written, the rest blank. How do you tell someone you love them when you know they'll read it after you're gone? How do you say goodbye in words that won't break their heart? How do you explain that the war isn't what they told you it would be? That sometimes the enemy wears your uniform? That sometimes the enemy is you? Hansen was the oldest, 28, had a wife back in Minnesota, had 2 children he'd never seen. Twin boys born 3 months after he shipped out. Their names were James and Robert. Hansen had their photographs pinned to the bunker wall, right next to the radio, right next to the orders that had brought them here, right next to the map that showed where they were supposed to be, which wasn't here, which wasn't anywhere near here. The photographs were starting to fade. The Minnesota humidity had gotten into the paper somehow, even here in the Belgian forest, even buried underground, even protected by concrete and earth, and the prayers Hansen whispered when he thought nobody was listening. The boys would be walking soon, would be saying their first words, would be calling for a father who might never come home to hear them. Hansen had been a teacher before the war, taught mathematics at a high school outside St. Paul, loved numbers, loved the way they made sense, loved how 2 plus 2 always equaled 4, no matter what else was happening in the world. But tonight, the numbers didn't add up. 37 American soldiers on those trucks, headed east toward enemy lines, without weapons, without proper escorts, without explanation. The mathematics of war suggested they were prisoners, but prisoners don't smile. Prisoners don't wave at hidden observers. Prisoners don't look relieved. The bunker's radio had been silent for 43 minutes, 44 now. In 8 months of operation, it had never been silent for more than 30 minutes. Never. The scheduled check-ins came every 2 hours. The emergency frequency was monitored continuously. The backup channels were swept hourly. But tonight, all frequencies were dead. All channels were empty. All voices were gone, as if headquarters had simply vanished, as if the war had ended, and nobody had bothered to tell the 3 men in the bunker. But the war hadn't ended. Artillery still rumbled in the distance. Flares still lit the horizon. Aircraft still passed overhead. German aircraft mostly. Flying low, flying slow, flying like they owned the sky. Which maybe they did now. Maybe something had changed. Maybe the convoy Mackenzie had seen was part of something larger. Something that required radio silence. Something that required American soldiers to disappear into the darkness. Mackenzie reached for the field telephone, a direct line to battalion headquarters. He'd used it twice in 8 months. Once, to report German armor moving north. Once, to request medical evacuation for a French civilian who'd stumbled into their sector with shrapnel in his chest. Both times, the response had been immediate, clear, professional. Tonight, the line was dead. Not busy, not damaged. Dead. As if it had been cut. As if someone didn't want them talking to battalion. The wooden crate they sat around had arrived 3 weeks ago, marked medical supplies. But it didn't contain medical supplies. It contained documents, maps, photographs, lists of names, American names, German names, names in languages Mackenzie couldn't identify. The documents were stamped top secret. The maps showed locations that didn't match any official charts. The photographs showed faces that might have been American, Might have been German. Might have been something else entirely. Nobody had told them what to do with the contents of the crate. Nobody had explained why it was delivered to their position instead of to headquarters. Nobody had mentioned it in any of the radio communications. It had simply appeared one morning, carried by two soldiers who didn't give their names, who didn't speak during the delivery, who left without explanation, who might not have been American despite their uniforms. At 11:52 p.m., footsteps approached the bunker. Slow steps, careful steps, steps that knew exactly where they were going, steps that had walked this route before, steps that belonged to someone who understood the rhythm of the forest, who knew which branches would snap, which leaves would rustle, which patches of snow would crunch underfoot. These were not the steps of a stranger. Mackenzie reached for his rifle, a Springfield in 1903, serial number 3741592, manufactured in 1942, zeroed at 200 yards, loaded with 5 rounds of .30-06 ammunition. He knew every scratch on the wooden stock, every flaw in the metal, every quirk of the trigger mechanism. The rifle had been with him since training, had been with him through 3 battles, had saved his life 4 times. Tonight it felt heavier than usual. Tonight it felt like something he didn't want to use. Coleman finally lit his cigarette. The flame illuminated his face. For 1 second, long enough to see the fear in his eyes, long enough to see that he was younger than he pretended to be. Maybe 19, maybe younger. The kind of young that made you lie about your age to enlist. The kind of young that made you eager to prove yourself. The kind of young that made you volunteer for dangerous assignments. The kind of young that didn't prepare you for nights like this. Hansen folded the letter and put it in his pocket, right next to his heart, right next to the photographs of his sons, right next to the medal he'd earned at Normandy, Bronze Star for valor, for carrying wounded men to safety under enemy fire, for doing what heroes do. But tonight, he felt like anything except a hero. Tonight he felt like a man who'd seen too much and understood too little. The footsteps stopped. Someone knocked. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. The code they'd been waiting for. The code that had been changed 3 times in the past month. The code that only 5 people were supposed to know. The code that meant everything would change. The code that meant nothing would ever be the same. The code that might not mean what it used to mean. Mackenzie stood up slowly. The concrete floor was slick with condensation, with melted snow that had dripped through gaps in the ceiling, with moisture from 3 men breathing in a sealed space for too many hours. He moved toward the door like a man walking to his execution, like a man who knew that opening the door would end something, would begin something else, would change him in ways he couldn't undo. The door was steel, painted green, camouflaged to look like a piece of debris from the air. From the ground it looked like nothing at all, like earth and stones and fallen branches. It opened inward, weighted with lead, so it would close automatically, so it would seal if they were killed, so their secrets would remain buried, so someone else would have to dig them up and decide what they meant. Mackenzie's hand touched the door handle, cast iron, cold as the grave, cold as the ground above them, cold as the metal in dead men's hands. He turned it slowly, 1/4 turn, 1/2 turn, 3/4, complete. The mechanism clicked, once, twice, 3 times, like a clock counting down to midnight, like a bomb preparing to explode, like the sound of time running out. The door opened 6 inches. Snow blew in. Real snow. Falling snow. Snow that had been falling all night. Snow that would keep falling until it covered everything, until it buried the evidence, until it made the world clean again, white and pure and innocent, the way it had been before men learned to kill each other, before war became the natural state of things, before peace became something you had to fight for. A figure stood in the snow, uniform without insignia, no rank markings, no unit patches, no identification tags visible, face without expression, eyes that reflected the bunker light like mirrors, like empty windows, like the eyes of someone who had learned to see too much and feel too little. The visitor was neither tall nor short, neither young nor old, neither friend nor enemy, just someone who was there when they weren't supposed to be. The visitor stepped inside without invitation, shook snow from his coat without ceremony, looked at each man without speaking, without blinking, without showing any sign of recognition or surprise or humanity. He moved like someone who had done this before, many times before, in many different bunkers, with many different sets of 3 frightened men. The convoy, Mackenzie said. Not a question, a statement, a confession, an admission that they had seen something they weren't supposed to see, something that connected to everything else, something that made sense of the radio silence and the dead telephone and the mysterious crate and the orders that didn't quite add up, something that explained why they were here instead of where they were supposed to be. The visitor nodded once. A single movement of his head, precise, economical, like everything about him. He reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, giving them time to understand that this was not a threatening gesture, that his hands were not weapons, that whatever he was reaching for would not kill them. Not immediately, not unless they made it necessary. He pulled out an envelope, brown paper, thick paper, government paper, the kind used for documents that matter, the kind that costs more than regular paper, the kind that lasts longer, the kind that survives fires and floods and explosions. Red seal, wax seal, pressed with an official stamp that none of them recognized. The kind of envelope that contained orders nobody wanted to carry out, orders that came from somewhere higher than battalion, higher than division, higher than anyone who was supposed to know about 3 men in a bunker beneath the Ardennes forest. Coleman's cigarette burned down to ash. The tobacco glowed red for 30 seconds, then faded, then died, like the match before it, like the hope that this night would end without changing everything, like the belief that they were fighting the right war for the right reasons in the right way. The ash fell to the dirt floor, mixed with other ash, other cigarettes, other moments when men realized they were smaller than the forces moving around them. Hanson's letter remained unfinished, would remain unfinished. Some letters are never meant to be sent. Some words are never meant to be written. Some truths are too dangerous to share with people who still believe the world makes sense, who still think their sons and husbands and fathers are heroes fighting for freedom, who still trust that their government tells them the truth about why men die in foreign places. Mackenzie's watch kept ticking toward midnight, each second louder than the one before, like a heartbeat in a chest that was learning to be afraid, like footsteps approaching from a distance, like the sound of time running out for everything they had believed, everything they had trusted, everything they had been willing to die for. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, 3 men learned what they were really fighting for. The envelope was opened at exactly 11:58 p.m. The visitor's fingers moved with practiced efficiency. No hesitation, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that the moment held any special significance. The wax seal cracked cleanly. The paper unfolded without tearing. The contents were visible for exactly 12 seconds before Mackenzie folded them again. 12 seconds that changed everything. 12 seconds that explained the convoy. The radio silence. The telephone that didn't work. The crate they weren't supposed to open. The orders that had brought them here. The war they thought they were fighting. The contents were read in silence. Words that couldn't be spoken aloud. Words that would sound like treason if anyone else heard them. Words that revealed the mathematics Hansen had been trying to solve. Why American soldiers were traveling east. Why they looked relieved instead of afraid. Why some wars require radio silence. Why some victories look exactly like defeats. Why some enemies wear your uniform. Why some heroes never come home. Why some stories are never told. The orders were understood without explanation, without discussion, without the luxury of refusing. Some orders transcend military hierarchy. Some orders come from necessities that don't care about rank or protocol or the moral preferences of three men in a bunker. Some orders are about survival, not personal survival, not national survival, something larger, something that encompasses both sides of a war that isn't really a war, something that requires American soldiers to disappear, to be forgotten, to become part of something else. At 12:01 a.m., December 4th, 1944, the war became personal. The visitor left the way he had come, without ceremony, without explanation, without looking back. The snow covered his footprints within minutes, as if he had never been there, as if the envelope had materialized on its own, as if the orders had written themselves, as if three men in a bunker had imagined the whole thing. But the envelope remained, and the orders remained, and the understanding remained, and the choice they had to make remained. What happened next isn't in any official record, isn't mentioned in any history book, isn't commemorated on any memorial wall. Some stories are too small for history, too quiet for remembrance, too human for the official version of events, too dangerous for people who still believe in the simple version of right and wrong, too complex for monuments and ceremonies and patriotic speeches about freedom and democracy and the price of peace. The bunker was empty by dawn, not abandoned, not destroyed, not discovered by enemy forces. Empty the way a room becomes empty when the people who lived there decide they can't live there anymore. Empty the way a life becomes empty when you learn that everything you believed was a story someone else told you. Empty the way hope becomes empty when you realize that winning and losing are sometimes the same thing. Mackenzie left his rifle behind, barreled down in the dirt floor, safety off, ready to fire if anyone tried to follow them, if anyone tried to understand what they had understood, if anyone tried to ask questions that didn't have acceptable answers. The Springfield 1903, serial number 3741592, still zeroed at 200 yards, still loaded with 5 rounds, still capable of saving lives, still capable of ending them. Coleman left his cigarettes behind. The pack his sister had sent him, the Camel brand tobacco, the last cigarette he would never smoke, left them on the wooden crate, next to the documents they weren't supposed to read, next to the maps that didn't match official charts, next to the photographs of faces that might have been American, might have been German, might have been something else entirely, something that transcended nationality, something that rendered uniforms meaningless. Hansen left his unfinished letter behind, 3 lines written to his mother, the rest blank, the words he couldn't find, the explanation he couldn't give, the goodbye he couldn't say. Left it next to the photographs of his twin sons, James and Robert, who would grow up without understanding why their father never came home, who would be told he died fighting for freedom, who would never know that some wars are fought for reasons that don't fit on memorial walls. The radio never did crackle back to life. The emergency frequency remained empty. The backup channels stayed silent. The field telephone stayed dead, as if headquarters had forgotten they existed, as if the chain of command had simply ended, as if 3 men in a bunker had become disconnected from the war they thought they were fighting, connected instead to something else, something that required radio silence, something that operated outside official channels, something that used American soldiers to fight battles that couldn't be acknowledged, couldn't be explained, couldn't be won. The convoy, that wasn't supposed to exist, continued east through the snow. 37 American soldiers, traveling toward enemy lines, traveling without weapons, traveling without proper escorts, traveling without fear, because they weren't traveling toward the enemy. They were traveling toward something else, toward an understanding that some wars have more than two sides, that some battles are fought by soldiers who wear their enemy's uniform, that some victories require sacrifices that can't be celebrated, can't be mourned, can't be remembered by anyone except the men who make them possible. And somewhere in the Ardennes forest, 3 men carried out orders that would never be written down, orders that would never be explained, orders that would never be forgotten by the men who survived to remember them, orders that connected to networks that spanned both sides of the war, networks that recognized no flags, no uniforms, no loyalties, except to the principle that some wars must end regardless of who wins them, that some peace must be purchased with lies, that some freedom requires unfreedom, that some truth can only be preserved by men who agree to carry secrets to their graves. They walked east, Mackenzie first, Coleman in the middle, Hansen last, following game trails through snow that covered their footprints, through forest that belonged to no country, through darkness that made all uniforms look the same. They carried no weapons, no identification, no way to prove who they had been before they learned what they now knew. They were no longer American soldiers, no longer part of an army, no longer fighting a war that made sense. They were something else now, something without a name, something that existed in the spaces between official stories, something that made the war possible by making it impossible to understand. Behind them, the bunker settled into silence, the kind of silence that follows secrets, the kind that grows heavier with time, the kind that eventually covers everything, like snow, like forgetting, like the official version of events that would be written later by men who weren't there, who didn't see the convoy, who didn't receive the orders, who didn't understand that some wars are fought by ghosts, by men who agree to disappear, by soldiers who become civilians, who become something else entirely. This story ends here, but the war didn't end. Wars never end. They just move to different bunkers, different forests, different men who learn too late what they're really fighting for, different secrets that require radio silence, different convoys that aren't supposed to exist, different envelopes with red wax seals, different orders that can't be written down, different choices between truth and survival, between loyalty and understanding, between the simple story and the complex one, between the war they tell you about and the war that actually happens. The snow kept falling, covered the bunker, covered the tracks, covered the evidence, made the world clean again, white and pure and innocent, the way it looks in photographs, the way it sounds in speeches, the way it feels when you don't know what lies beneath the surface, what happened in rooms that don't exist, what orders were carried out by men who were never there, what wars were fought by soldiers who never existed, what peace was purchased with secrets that died with the men who kept them. Some stories are too true to tell, too important to remember, too dangerous to forget. This is one of them. A story about 3 men who learned that winning a war sometimes requires losing yourself, that serving your country sometimes requires betraying it, that keeping faith sometimes requires abandoning it entirely, that some nights in December change everything, that some envelopes contain more than orders, that some wars are fought in bunkers, buried so deep that the men who fight them disappear entirely, become part of the earth, part of the silence, part of the secret that makes victory possible and peace affordable and freedom, something that someone else pays for in currencies that don't have names. The war became personal, at 12:01 a.m. on December 4th, 1944, for three men who ceased to exist, who became part of something larger than themselves, something that transcended nations and uniforms, and the simple story of good versus evil, something that required sacrifice without recognition, service without honor, victory without celebration, truth without voice, love of country that looked exactly like treason, loyalty that required betrayal, faith that demanded apostasy. This story ends here. But the war didn't end, and somewhere in the darkness, in bunkers that don't exist on any map, other men receive other envelopes, other orders, other choices, other opportunities to learn what they're really fighting for, other invitations to disappear, other chances to serve their country by forgetting they ever belonged to it, other moments when the war becomes personal, when winning requires losing everything, when peace demands war, when the only way to remain human is to stop being anything that has a name.